The wagon wheels stopped turning in the yard of the Coldwell farm on the second Tuesday of March, 1887, and by noon the house smelled of coffee gone bitter on the stove and of the wet wool coats hung by the door. Jacob Coldwell had been dead 11 days. His 3 children stood now in the front room where his body had lain, waiting on the county clerk to read out what little he had put down on paper before the fever took him. Silas, the eldest, stood with his hat still on, arms crossed over a coat too thin for the wind outside. Edgar, the second son, chewed at the inside of his cheek and watched the clerk's hands like a man watching cards get dealt. Adeline stood apart from them both, near the window, her husband Thomas a half step behind her, his hand resting light on the small of her back, not holding her up, just letting her know he was there. The clerk read plainly, without ceremony. To Silas, the north 80 acres and the good well. To Edgar, the cattle, 11 head, plus the wagon and the 2 mules. To Adeline, daughter, the household goods remaining in the cedar trunk in the loft. Silas did not look at his sister. Edgar did. That trunk's curtains, Edgar said. Ma's old lace. Some thread, likely. Nothing that'll feed a family. It's what's left, the clerk said, and closed the folder. Nobody argued the division. There was nothing in it to argue. Adeline had expected the land to go to her brothers. That was the way of things in Harlow Junction, same as every township for 100 miles in any direction, and she had not come to the reading expecting different. Still, when Silas and Edgar rode out that same afternoon to see to the cattle before dark, neither one offered to help carry the trunk down from the loft. Thomas did it alone, the trunk heavier than its size suggested, the wood swollen at the corners from some old water damage. He set it down in the bed of their own wagon without a word, and Adeline climbed up beside it, one hand flat against the lid the whole ride home, for miles of frozen rut and thaw mud, saying nothing the entire way. That night, by lamplight, she opened it. Lace as promised. Yards of it, folded in tissue gone yellow, some pieces no wider than a handkerchief and others long enough to dress a full window. Panels her mother, Ruth, had made across 30 years of evenings after the supper dishes were done. There were shuttles in a tin box, worn smooth at the edges from her mother's thumb. There was a crochet hook filed down at the tip to a fineness no store-bought hook matched. There was a folded muslin apron, still faintly marked with the pattern of a lace collar pinned to it, half-finished, abandoned the week Ruth died. And there was Patch. The old dog had come with the trunk more by accident than intention. Nobody had thought to divide him at all, and when the wagon left the yard, he had simply climbed up onto the trunk and lain down, and no one called him back. He was gray in the muzzle and slow in the hip, herding stock too old now to need much herding. Silas had said, not unkindly, that the dog wasn't worth the feed he'd cost. Adeline had said nothing, only opened the wagon gate wider. She sat that first night with the lace across her lap, running her thumb along a border of small looped knots, and Thomas watched her from the other chair, mending a harness strap, saying nothing either. It was not sorrow exactly, the quiet between them. It was closer to waiting. It was 3 nights later, working the false bottom loose to see if damp had gotten into the wood, that Adeline found the second lining. Beneath a layer of cedar shims, flat against the trunk's floor, lay a ledger book, bound in oilcloth to keep the damp out, and beneath that, a folded letter in her mother's hand. The ledger was thin, 40 pages, most of them filled in a small tight script. Dates, yardage, prices. Ruth Coldwell had sold lace. Not much, not often, but steadily, for 11 years, to a dry goods house in Omaha that paid by the yard for fine work, 35 cents a yard for plain edging, up to $1.10 for the wide bridal panels. The last entry was dated the spring before she died, 41 yards shipped, $14.35 received. The letter was shorter. It said only that the pattern book was sewn into the lining of the trunk's lid, that the work took patience before it took skill, and that a woman with steady hands need never go hungry so long as she had thread and daylight. At the bottom, in a hand grown unsteady near the end, Ruth had written one more line. The storm lace keeps a house warmer than the stove does, if you lay it right. Ask no one how. Just lay it. Adeline did not understand that last part yet. She would. She unpicked the lid's lining with a seam ripper by lamplight and found the pattern book, drawings, mostly, diagrams of knots and crossings, some in her mother's hand, and some far older, foreign-looking, the paper brittle at the folds. There were patterns for edging and patterns for full window panels, and near the back, a diagram unlike the others. Not lace for beauty, but lace doubled and doubled again, backed with muslin, meant to be stuffed thick with raw wool and hung flat against an inside wall. Storm lace. Her mother's mother had brought the pattern from the old country. The notes said, back when houses there were built of logs too, and window glass was a luxury few could afford, and the winters came hard and long. Thomas read the ledger over her shoulder that night, slow, the way he read anything, twice through before he spoke. $14, he said, for thread and evenings. 11 years of evenings, Adeline said. He didn't argue it. He only reached over and turned the lamp wick up a little higher, so she'd have better light to work by. She began in April, with what thread remained in the trunk, some 40 yards of fine cotton, wound tight on the shuttles, enough by her mother's ledger reckoning for perhaps 6 yards of finished edging if the work went clean. It did not go clean. Her fingers, strong from churning and wash day and rope work, were too heavy for the shuttle. The first night she made 11 inches of lace before she saw the flaw, a double knot where there should have been a single, the whole row pulling crooked once she reached the end of it. She unpicked it. 90 minutes of work undone in 4. The second attempt ran to 2 feet before a snag thread left a hole the size of a thumbnail dead in the center of a rosette. She unpicked that too. By the end of the first week she had produced, by her own count written small in the back of her mother's ledger in a matching hand now, for completed yards and 31 unpicked. She wrote down every measurement, every failure, thread used, hours spent. It was not sentiment that made her keep the numbers. It was the only way she knew to prove to herself the work was moving forward at all, when the lace itself gave so little evidence of it. Thomas watched her hands grow raw at the fingertips, small cracks opening where the thread bit in, and one evening he came in from the barn with a jar of tallow and set it on the table beside her without comment. She rubbed it into her hands before bed that night and every night after. He never mentioned it again, and she never thanked him for it in words. It simply became a thing that was done, like feeding the stove. By June she had 11 finished yards, edging mostly, a few small collars, one attempt at a full rosette panel that came out lopsided and went into the mending basket rather than the sale pile. 11 yards, at her mother's old prices, would fetch perhaps $4. She rode into Harlow Junction on a Saturday to find out if it would fetch anything at all. Otis Pruitt ran the dry goods store at the corner of Front and Second, and had run it since before the war, and considered himself a fair judge of anything that came across his counter, cloth or coffee or character. He held Adeline's 11 yards up to the window light for a long moment, turning it, squinting at the knotwork the way a man squints at a horse's teeth. "Your mother's work?" he asked. "Mine," Adeline said. He set it down on the counter, not unkindly, but plain. "It's serviceable. It's not your mother's." He named a price, 12 cents a yard, less than a third of Ruth's old rate. "Folks around here buy lace for a wedding dress or a christening gown. Mrs. Vance, not for practice pieces." No offense meant. None taken, she told him, and did not haggle, and did not sell it either. She wrapped the 11 yards back in their tissue and rode the 4 miles home with the parcel across her lap, same as the day the trunk came. Word travels faster in a township of 400 souls than a horse can carry it. By the following Sunday, after service, she heard secondhand, the way such things always arrive, softened by a neighbor's kindness and sharpened by a stranger's tongue, that Edgar had said at the feed store that his sister was playing at lace like a girl with a sampler while her husband broke sod alone. Silas had said nothing, which was its own kind of saying. Adeline did not answer either report. She went home and threaded the shuttle again. It took her until the first frost, late September, to produce 91 yards of finished work, edgings, 2 full panels, a christening set. She'd worked from a pattern in her mother's book with a border of small looped rosettes she'd finally gotten even on the 9th attempt. She kept the ledger faithfully. 91 yards. 206 hours by her own count, tracked in quarter-hour marks down the margin. 14 shuttles of thread used to the spool's end. 3 fingers with permanent thread grooves worn into the pads. It was Thomas who suggested, in his quiet way, that a dry goods buyer traveling the rail line out of Omaha might judge the work by a fairer measure than Otis Pruitt's counter-trade. He wrote the letter himself, in his own plain hand, because Adeline's fingers by evening were too stiff from the day's work to hold a pen steady, and he addressed it to the same wholesale house whose name appeared 11 years running in Ruth Coldwell's ledger. The house sent a man in October. Charles Renwick arrived by hired buggy on a gray afternoon with rain threatening, a leather satchel of samples across his knees, and the manner of a man who had looked at 10,000 yards of lace in his working life and found most of it wanting. He did not sit. He held each piece to the window the same way Otis Pruitt had, but longer, and he turned it over to check the reverse side, which Otis had not thought to do. Even tension, he said, half to himself, running a thumbnail along a row of picots. That's rarer than people credit. Most homework is loose on one side. Tight on the return, you can feel it pucker. This doesn't. He held the christening set up to the gray light a long moment. Bruges Point, this border. Where'd the pattern come from? My mother's mother, Adeline said. Brought over. Renwick nodded slowly, as though that answered something he'd half suspected. He counted the yardage himself, checked it twice against her own written tally, and found her count matched his to the half yard. 90 cents on the finished edging, $1.40 on the panels, $2 on the christening set as a whole, he said. And I'll take everything you can produce through the winter at those rates, provided the tension holds. He wrote the terms out himself, plain, no flourish, and left a deposit against the winter's order before the rain caught him on the road back to the depot. 91 yards had sold, that day, for just over $106. Otis Pruitt heard the figure within the week, the way such figures always traveled, and said nothing further about practice pieces. He began, in fact, to ask, carefully, the way a man asks a thing he isn't sure he's owed an answer to, whether Mrs. Vance might consider consigning a few pieces through his own counter, at a fairer split than he'd first offered. She considered it. She said she would think on it. She did not say yes that day. The autumn of 1887 turned hard early. By the second week of November, a wind came down off the plains that Harlow Junction old-timers called a harbinger. Not a blizzard proper, but 3 days of driving cold and gusts that old Reverend Kessler measured, by his own barometer, at close to 40 miles an hour, with the temperature dropping to 11 degrees below zero on the second night. Silas lost 4 calves to the cold that week, caught in a draw with insufficient windbreak. Edgar's cattle fared little better. 2 head went down and did not get up, and he spent 2 days after digging frozen ground to bury what the cold had taken before the wolves found them. Adeline and Thomas lost nothing. She had spent September and October, between shuttle work, sewing the storm lace panels from her grandmother's diagram. Doubled lace backed with muslin, packed thick with raw wool batting bought cheap off a shearing at 4 cents the pound, hung flat against the inside log walls behind the ordinary curtains where no visitor would ever think to look for them. 6 windows, 6 panels, plus 2 long runs along the north and west walls where the wind struck hardest. It had taken her 11 evenings of work she did not bill to Mr. Renwick's account, because it was not lace meant for selling. It was lace meant for keeping. On the second night of the wind, with the lamp turned low and the stove banked for the night, Thomas laid his palm flat against the inside of the north wall, where the lace and wool panel hung behind the curtain, and held it there a long moment. Warm, he said. Just the one word. Outside. The wind found every crack it could in Edgar's newer frame house 4 miles east and Silas's older soddy 2 miles north, and both men banked their stoves near to danger trying to hold the cold at bay. In the Vance cabin, the fire held steady on half the wood, and Patch slept unbothered on the hearthstone rather than pressed against it for warmth, and Adeline wrote in the ledger that night, 3 days, 11 below, half cordwood used against a normal week. She did not write anything about her brothers. The numbers said what needed saying. The winter order from Omaha called for more lace than she could produce on hand-spun thread alone, and finer cotton thread cost money she and Thomas did not readily have. Not with the harvest thin that year and the mortgage note on their own 80 acres still carrying 3 years to run. Renwick's advance had covered part of it. It was not enough for the quantity of thread the winter contract required, plus wool batting enough for the neighbors who had, by December, begun quietly asking whether Mrs. Vance might make up a set of storm panels for their own walls, seeing as the Vance stove burned half what it ought. Thomas never asked her to sell the cow. She offered it herself, on a Tuesday in December, standing at the fence rail with her arms crossed against the cold, watching the animal's breath cloud in the frozen air. Bess gives $6 a month in cream money, she said. Sold outright. She's worth 22, maybe 24 to the right buyer. That buys thread enough to finish the winter contract twice over, and wool besides. Thomas said only that Bess was a good milker, which was true, and that they'd managed the cream shortfall somehow, which was also true, and did not otherwise argue it. He drove her to the Pruitt place himself 2 days later, where Otis's brother-in-law kept a small dairy operation and paid $22 without much haggling, cash on the spot. They drank their coffee black that winter and thinned what milk they had for the 2 younger children boarding with them, a niece and nephew of Thomas's, orphaned the spring before, who ate at their table and called Adeline aunt in a voice still uncertain of its welcome. It was for them, in some part, that she'd made the trade. A cow's worth of cream against the certainty of finished thread and a warm house. She did not call it a sacrifice, in the ledger or aloud. She wrote only, cow sold, 22. Thread ordered, wool bought. Balance in hand, 3.40. Silas came by in January, on some pretext about a borrowed harrow blade he'd meant to return since autumn, and stood in the yard a long while before he came to the door. Adeline let him in, poured him coffee thin the same as everyone's that winter, and did not press him on why he'd really come. He noticed the panels behind the curtains, the shape of them, the extra thickness at the window frames, and ran a knuckle along one edge without asking permission. This the wool and lace business, he said. Not quite a question. Grandmother's pattern, Adeline said. Storm lace. He said nothing further about it that visit. But the following week, unasked, he sent his hired boy over with a wagon load of raw wool batting off his own fall shearing. More than Adeline needed for the panels still owed to 2 neighbor families, delivered with no note and no explanation, the boy gone again before she could properly thank him. Edgar's reconciliation, when it came, was smaller and slower. He had said the hardest things, back in the spring, and pride held him longer than it held his brother. It was not until February, after the calves he'd lost in November, that he rode over one evening and sat a long while in the kitchen without much talk, watching Adeline's hands move at the shuttle, the small clicking rhythm of bone against thread. He watched Thomas mend a bridle. He watched Patch, gray-muzzled, thump his tail twice at the fire and settle again. Before he left, he split a rick of firewood in the yard, unasked, stacked it neat against the north wall of the house, the wall with the thickest panel behind it, and rode home in the dark without a word about it. Adeline found the stack in the morning and said nothing to him about it either the next time they met. It was not the kind of debt that wanted speaking of. The blizzard came on the 12th, though by the calendar it should have been the following winter's story. The great storm arrived a year to the week after that first hard wind, in 1888, and every soul on the plains who lived through it would measure their life afterward by whether they'd been caught out in it or safe indoors when it struck. The morning had broken warm for January. Nearly 40 degrees, a false spring smell in the air that sent farmers out in shirt sleeves to tend stock they'd normally have left penned, and sent children to school without their heaviest coats, since the walk that morning had been almost pleasant. By early afternoon the sky along the northwest horizon had gone the color of a fresh bruise, and within the hour the temperature began to fall the way water falls off a roof edge, not gradually, but all at once. The wind came first, a wall of it, driving a fine hard snow that didn't fall so much as travel sideways, so thick a man could lose sight of his own barn 30 feet off. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. By nightfall it stood at 18 below zero, with wind gusting past 40 miles an hour, and visibility, by every account collected after, at less than an arm's length in the worst of it. Adeline had been at the shuttle when the first gust rattled the window glass hard enough to worry it in the frame. She looked up. Thomas was already at the door, pulling on his coat. "The Renner children," he said. "School lets out at 3. The schoolhouse stood 3/4 of a mile east, across open ground with no windbreak worth the name. Half a dozen families' children walked that road daily, the 2 Vance Wards among them, a boy of 9 and a girl of 7, both boarded out that morning same, as always with their dinner pails and their thin coats, because the morning had been warm. Thomas took the rope line he kept coiled by the door for exactly such weather. Every farmer on the plains kept one, tied porch post to barn door, because a man could lose his own house in a storm like this one and freeze 40 feet from his own hearth. and he tied one end to the porch rail and the other about his own waist and went out into it. Adeline did not stand at the window watching. There was nothing to see past the glass but white and moving dark, and standing there served no one. She banked the stove high, put water on to heat, laid every blanket in the house across the kitchen table's 2 chairs pulled close to the fire, and she waited, the shuttle idle in her lap, her hands still for the first time in months. It hissed. Snow struck the window glass in sheets, and where it struck the panes without the storm lace backing, needles of frost crept in along the sash within the hour, fine white crystals climbing the inside of the glass. Where the backed panels hung, the glass stayed clear, only fogged faintly with the room's own warmth. Patch paced the length of the kitchen floor and back, ears low, and pressed himself finally against the door, as if his old body might somehow help hold it shut against the wind's weight. 40 minutes. An hour. The lamp guttered once in a draft that found its way past even the storm lace at the door frame and steadied. Then the door. Thomas came through first, half carrying the boy, both of them rimed white, ice in the child's eyelashes and the fine hairs at his temple. Behind him the girl, walking on her own but barely, one mitten gone somewhere in the white, her hand curled hard against her chest. Thomas had found them a quarter-mile short of home, the teacher having sent the older children out early at the first sign of the sky changing. The group of them scattered and half lost on the open road when the visibility dropped past anything a body could navigate by landmark. There was no shouting in that kitchen. No one wept loudly or made a scene of it. Adeline peeled the boy's frozen coat from him and wrapped him first in the blanket nearest the fire, not the coldest one, and rubbed his hands slow between her own, not fast. Fast rubbing on frozen skin does more harm than the cold itself. Her mother had taught her that once, long before any of this. She did the same for the girl. Thomas stood dripping ice onto the floorboards and said only, "Renners, too, are at the Kesslers." Teacher held the little ones back at the schoolhouse. They fed the children warm broth by the spoonful, not too fast, and laid them close by the stove wrapped in the storm lace panels themselves, taken down off the walls for the one night, while batting and all, warmer wrapped close about small bodies than any quilt in the house. Patch lay against the boy's feet without being asked and did not move again till morning. Outside, the storm held 3 days. Word came after, slow, the way word always came in a country that size, carried by whoever first dared the roads once the wind laid down. The Kessler place had lost window glass entire on the north face, 2 panes blown clean out of their frames by the wind's pressure, and the family had spent the worst of the second night huddled in the root cellar for want of a warmer room. Otis Pruitt's store had frozen solid through. Every tin of preserve on his shelves split at the seams, the pot-belly stove unable to hold the room above 40 degrees no matter how he fed it. 3 children from families further out on the open prairie had not made it home at all that first night, and were found, as so many were found across that country in the days after, within calling distance of a fence line or a farmhouse. They simply could not see through the white to reach. The Vance cabin held 18 below outside and 61 within, by Thomas's own thermometer nailed to the porch post, through all 3 days of it. Adeline wrote the numbers down that same week, in the ledger, beside the older entries of yardage and thread. 3 days, low of 18 below, house held 61, half the what a normal week would ask. 2 children safe. She wrote nothing more than that. The numbers said what needed saying. Spring came slow that year, as it does after such a winter, the thaw arriving in fits, the creek running high with snowmelt through most of April. Adeline and Thomas dug out the drifted yard together, the same as everyone in Harlow Junction dug out that spring, and found beneath the snow the ordinary business of a farm waiting to resume. Fence posts to reset, a henhouse roof to patch where the weight of the drift had strained the beam. Silas came by in the first warm week with his own team and helped reset the fence line without being asked twice, working alongside Thomas most of a Saturday, the two of them saying little, passing tools back and forth the way men do who've settled something without discussing it. Edgar sent his wife over that same spring, quiet and a little uncertain at first, to ask whether Adeline might teach her the storm lace pattern for their own place, seeing as Edgar had lost 2 more head that January before the worst of the storm ever reached them, caught exposed in a poorly wind-broken pen. Adeline taught her at the kitchen table over 3 afternoons, The shuttle passed hand to hand, the same patient correcting of a knot pulled crooked that her own mother might once have offered her, had there been time enough left for it. Otis Pruitt stocked her lace on his own shelves that summer, a full corner of the store given over to it, and never again used the word practice in front of her or behind her back that anyone carried home to repeat. Mr. Renwick's winter order, renewed that autumn, ran to 310 yards at the improved rate, plus a standing commission on the storm lace pattern itself, which Renwick's Omaha house had taken an interest in selling as a pattern book to other prairie wives further west, where the winters came no gentler. The ledger kept growing, page after page in that same small script, numbers where another woman might have written feelings. Yards, hours, dollars, degrees below zero survived. Cords of wood not burned. It was, in its own way, the only account of that year Adeline ever felt the need to keep, because the numbers had never once lied to her, not in the failed rows unpicked in April, nor in the 61 degrees held through 18 below in January. Pride could be argued with. A ledger could not. She sits some evenings still, Thomas beside her mending a strap, Patch older now and slower still but present, the two wards grown a year taller and no longer strangers at the table, working a shuttle by lamplight the same as her mother once did, the same small clicking rhythm carrying through a house that holds its warmth against whatever the planes choose to send it. Nobody in Harlow Junction calls it just curtains anymore. Nobody needed to say they were wrong about it, either. The walls said it for them, all through that blizzard and every winter since, in the only language that country had ever fully trusted. Not a word spoken, but a house that stood warm while the wind outside took everything it could find that wasn't built to last.